Imagine walking into a place where time has stopped, where the walls are rotting, but whispers still echo. It's whispers that don't belong to the living. Tonight's story isn't just about an abandoned building. It's about a hospital that was left behind for reasons no one dares to talk about. Okay? And the person who made the mistake of stepping inside. What they saw, what they heard, and what they barely survived will make you question whether some doors should stay locked forever. Ethan wasn't easily scared. He carried a flashlight, a backpack, and his phone for recording. He pushed the heavy doors open. The smell of mildew and rust hit him like a wall. His footsteps echoed through the long, empty corridor. Faded signs still pointed to the emergency ward, intensive care unit, morgue. The deeper he went, the colder it became. His flashlight flickered against peeling paint and broken stretchers left in the hallway. But then he noticed something strange. On the wall, written in what looked like old, dried blood, were the words, "Don't stay after midnight." He laughed it off, assuming it was just graffiti left by teenagers. But the laughter died in his throat when he realized his watch had stopped at exactly 11:59 p.m. Ethan wasn't easily scared. He carried a flashlight, a backpack, and his phone for recording. As he pushed the heavy doors open, the smell of mildew and rust hit him like a wall. His footsteps echoed through the long, empty corridor. Faded signs still pointed to the emergency ward, intensive care unit, morgue. The deeper he went, the colder it became. His flashlight flickered against peeling paint and broken stretchers left in the hallway. But then he noticed something strange. On the wall, written in what looked like old, dried blood, were the words, "Don't stay after midnight." He laughed it off, assuming it was just graffiti left by teenagers. But the laughter died in his throat when he realized his watch had stopped at exactly 11:59 p.m. He shook his wrist, tapping the face of the watch, hoping it was just a mechanical glitch. But the second hand didn't move. The silence in the hall pressed against his ears, as if even time itself had stopped moving inside this place. He muttered under his breath, trying to keep calm. "Battery's dead, that's all." But the unease crept in, crawling up his spine. Something about the way the numbers froze, locked at that moment, felt intentional. Like a warning he was too stubborn to understand. As he turned a corner, the beam of his flashlight fell across an old wheelchair, rusted and tipped on its side. Beside it, a single shoe lay abandoned, still faintly marked with dried mud, as if it had been dropped there not long ago. He frowned, nudging it with his boot, only for a sharp metallic clang to echo behind him. Spinning around, he found nothing, just the long hallway stretching into darkness. But the sound hadn't been his imagination. It was distinct, like something metallic falling to the floor. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and pressed forward. The walls here were covered in old medical posters, faded to the point of illegibility, except one. Paper still clung to the board, its edges curling with age. It was a missing person notice. The photograph was blurred, water damaged, but the name at the bottom was just barely readable. Ethan Price. His heart stopped. That was his name. His exact name. He tore the paper from the wall, staring at the faded letters. The date listed beneath was from 1989, long before he had even been born. A sudden chill swept through the hallway, and his flashlight dimmed again. He heard a faint rattling sound, like breath being pulled through a broken throat. His chest tightened as he scanned the hall, the beam of light trembling in his hand. Something moved at the far end, a shadow darker than the rest of the corridor, bending unnaturally like it was crawling along the ceiling. He blinked hard, thinking his eyes were playing tricks, but when he looked again, it was closer. His instincts screamed to leave, but when he turned back toward the entrance, the corridor stretched endlessly. No doors, no exits, just the same hallway repeating over and over. His breaths came fast, echoing in the silence, until the whisper returned. "Help me." This time, It wasn't faint. It was right beside his ear. He spun, swinging the flashlight wildly, but no one was there, only the echoes of his own panicked heartbeat. He stumbled forward, desperate to find any way out. His boots crunched on shards of broken glass scattered across the floor. He didn't even notice the trail of bloody footprints forming behind him. Footprints he was leaving. The hallway opened into a larger room, the faint remnants of an old waiting area. Chairs toppled over, papers scattered, the reception desk splintered with age. On the counter lay an old ledger, its pages stiff with water damage. Against his better judgment, he opened it. Every name written inside was crossed out. Every single one, except the last entry, scrawled in jagged red ink. Ethan Price admitted. 11:59 p.m. He dropped the book instantly, his breath coming out ragged. The sound of distant footsteps grew louder, approaching from every direction at once. He realized then, with bone-deep dread, that the hospital hadn't been abandoned at all. It had been waiting for him. Do you want me to keep expanding this chapter, further adding more suspense before the first real encounter war move on into the next chapter of the story with this much detail? Ethan tried to shake off the unease and kept walking. He found himself near the old surgical ward. Its covered instruments lay scattered across the floor, and a broken gurney sat in the center of the room. That's when he heard it, a faint whisper. At first, he thought it was the wind slipping through cracks in the walls, but then he heard it again, clearer, closer. Help me. He froze, shining his flashlight in every direction. The room was empty, but when he turned back, the gurney had moved just a few inches, but enough that he knew it hadn't been that way before. His phone buzzed suddenly, a notification, but when he checked, the screen was black like it had died. Then a face appeared for a split second, pale, eyeless, screaming silently. And just as quickly, it was gone. His phone was back on, like nothing had happened. But now, Ethan wasn't sure he was alone anymore. Ethan's hands were shaking as he tightened his grip on the flashlight. The silence around him was suffocating, pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. He forced himself to take a step closer to the gurney, his boots scraping against the cracked tile. It hadn't moved much, but enough to make him feel like the room itself was alive, shifting when he wasn't looking. He crouched low, shining the beam under the gurney. Nothing, just dust and broken shards of glass. But the moment he straightened up, he noticed something new on the mattress, a handprint, small, thin, smeared in something dark that glistened under the light. It hadn't been there seconds ago. His breath quickened. The whisper returned, this time behind him. He spun so fast, the flashlight almost slipped from his grasp. The room was empty again, only his shadow twitching on the walls. He licked his lips nervously, whispering to himself, "It's just my mind messing with me. That's all." But then he noticed the door he had entered through. It was no longer open. It was closed. It's tight, though he hadn't touched it. He rushed over, grabbing the handle and yanking hard, but it wouldn't budge. The rusted metal groaned under his effort, but it refused to give. Behind him, the sound of wheels squeaked across the tiles. He whipped around, and the gurney was moving on its own, rolling slowly across the floor as if pushed by invisible hands. It stopped in front of him, blocking the way. For a moment, he just stared at it, frozen in disbelief. Then his phone vibrated again. He fumbled to pull it out, the glow of the screen illuminating his face in the dark. A new video file had appeared, labeled with the current date and time. His thumb trembled as he tapped it open. The video showed the surgical ward this exact room from the corner, as though someone had been recording him. And there he was, standing by the gurney. But in the recording, something stood behind him. It was tall, faceless, its head tilting unnaturally, its body flickering like static on an old TV. And as he watched in horror, the figure in the video slowly reached out for him. The screen cut to black before contact. Ethan staggered back, dropping the phone to the floor. It clattered against the tiles, but the screen stayed lit, glowing faintly. He crouched to pick it up, only to see his own reflection in the glass. Except the reflection didn't move when he did. Its mouth stretched open in a silent scream. He stumbled away, clutching his head, trying to convince himself it wasn't real. The whispers rose again, but now there were more of them. Dozens of voices layered on top of each other, circling him from all sides. Some cried, some laughed, some begged. Okay. The sound drilled into his ears until his vision blurred. The lights overhead flickered once, twice, then went out completely. His flashlight beam was the only source of light left, and it was dimming, the batteries draining faster than they should. He slapped it against his palm, desperate to keep it alive. When the light steadied, he nearly screamed. The surgical tools scattered on the floor weren't where they had been. Now they were arranged neatly on the counter, lined up as though a surgeon was preparing for an operation. Fresh drops of liquid slid down the metal, glinting wet and red. Ethan backed toward the wall, heart pounding, until he felt something cold and sharp press against the back of his neck. He froze, too afraid to move. Slowly, he turned his head. A scalpel was hovering in the air behind him, suspended by nothing. It clattered to the floor when he screamed, the sound bouncing off the walls in a way that felt endless. The voices fell silent all at once, leaving only his panicked breathing. He bent down to grab his phone again, his only comfort. But this time the screen displayed just 2 words. Look up. His body locked with terror. His chest rose and fell rapidly as his eyes shifted upward, against every instinct screaming at him not to. The ceiling above him was crawling arms, legs, pale faces pressed against the tiles as if bodies were trapped inside, writhing to break free. The tiles cracked, dust raining down on his head as one pale, skeletal hand forced its way out, reaching down toward him. He stumbled back, his voice hoarse with panic as he shouted, "Stay away from me." But another hand broke through, and another. The ceiling was splitting apart, bodies trying to drag themselves into the room. He bolted for the door again, slamming his shoulder against it with all his strength. This time it gave way, bursting open into the hallway. He stumbled through, gasping for breath, but even here the whispers followed. The hospital wasn't letting him go. He ran blindly, turning corner after corner, desperate for escape. The halls seemed endless, looping back on themselves, each corridor identical to the last. Every shadow looked alive. Every flicker of his light revealed movement just at the edge of sight. He realized with growing dread that the hospital wasn't just trapping him inside. It was rearranging itself around him, making sure he'd never find a way out. Do you want me to keep extending this moment until Ethan discovers the psychiatric ward? Or should I stretch out the surgical ward encounter even more with more paranormal details? Determined to leave, Ethan retraced his steps. But no matter how many turns he made, the halls seemed to twist and loop back on themselves. The exit signs glowed faintly, but every time he followed one, he ended up in the same hallway, standing before the door marked Psychiatric Ward. Against his better judgment, he opened it. Inside were rows of cells with rusted bars. The walls were scratched with desperate messages. They won't let us leave. Don't trust the doctors. He is still here. And then Ethan heard a slow dragging sound from the far end of the ward. Something was moving. He shined his flashlight and saw a figure crawling out of one of the cells. It wasn't human anymore. Slim's bent wrong, its face twisted into a permanent scream, its hospital gown torn and soaked with stains that hadn't faded in decades. It dragged itself forward, leaving a dark trail behind it. And when it spoke, Ethan's blood turned to ice. You shouldn't have come. Ethan staggered back, his flashlight beam trembling in his grip. The figure's voice wasn't just sound. It felt like it was vibrating inside his skull, clawing at his thoughts. He wanted to run, but his legs felt like lead, his body refusing to listen to him. The creature crawled forward, its bones cracking with every movement. Its jaw hung too wide, as if unhinged, and its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were just hollow sockets that seemed to drink in the light from his torch. Ethan forced himself to move, stumbling to the side and pressing against the cold bars of a cell. The rust cut into his palm, but he didn't care. He needed space, anything to keep that thing from reaching him. His light darted across the cell doors, and for a split second, he saw faces behind the bars. Dozens of them, gaunt, pale, and silent, just staring at him with unblinking eyes. When he blinked again, the cells were empty, but the sound of breathing remained. The dragging sound grew louder, closer. The creature's nails scraped the tiles, leaving deep gouges as it crawled, pulling itself along with unnatural strength. Ethan knew if he stayed still, it would reach him. With a burst of adrenaline, he bolted down the row of cells. His footsteps echoed like gunshots in the silence. He didn't dare look back, but he could hear the thing behind him, scraping, dragging, gaining speed. His chest burned as he reached the end of the ward and found another door. The sign above it was faded, but he could just make out the word, observation. He shoved the door open and slammed it shut behind him, fumbling for something to block it. His eyes darted around the room. Dusty chairs, a broken table, shards of glass. He jammed the table against the door, praying it would hold. The room smelled of rot and disinfectant, a combination that made his stomach twist. Old one-way mirrors lined the walls, cracked and clouded with age. He stepped closer to one, shining his light against it. For a moment, he thought he saw only his reflection. But then his reflection smiled. Ethan staggered back, his throat tight. His reflection pressed his hand against the glass, even though he hadn't moved. Then another reflection appeared beside it, and another. Soon the mirrors were filled with distorted copies of him, each grinning, each whispering soundless words. A loud bang rattled the door. The table screeched across the floor as something slammed against it from the other side. The dragging sound had returned, and it was furious now, relentless. The table shifted with each blow, the wood splintering under the force. Ethan backed away from the door, clutching his flashlight like a weapon. His breaths came sharp and uneven, every muscle in his body trembling. He knew the table wouldn't hold much longer, and the whispers in the mirrors grew louder, filling the room, overlapping until they became deafening. They all chanted the same thing over and over, their mouths stretching unnaturally wide. Asterisk, you belong here. You belong here. Asterisk. The door burst open. The table flew across the room, crashing into the mirrors. The glass shattered, raining shards everywhere. The reflections didn't vanish. They stepped out, climbing through the broken surfaces, moving toward him in perfect unison. He spun in place, searching desperately for another exit, but the room was closing in on him. The air grew heavy, his chest tight with every breath. The first reflection reached out, its hand icy as it brushed his arm, screamed and swiped at it with the flashlight, the beam cutting through its form, making it flicker, but it didn't stop. More hands reached for him, clawing, pulling. He stumbled backward, tripping over broken glass, the shards biting into his skin. He hit the ground hard, the flashlight rolling out of his grip, spinning until it pointed straight up at the ceiling. And there, painted above him in jagged red letters he hadn't noticed before, were the words, asterisk, you were never meant to leave. Asterisk. Ethan ran. His flashlight beam shook wildly across the walls. He stumbled into the morgue, the smell of decay hitting him harder than before. Cold storage doors lined the wall, most sealed shut, except one. It was slightly open. Before he could back away, it slammed closed with a metallic bang. The room went dark. His flashlight flickered once, twice, then died. That's when he heard them. Dozens of whispers surrounding him. Patients, doctors, soul voices overlapping, crying, laughing, screaming. The sound grew louder until it felt like it was inside his head. Suddenly, something grabbed his arm. Cold, bony fingers dug into his skin. "Oh," he screamed, pulling away, but the hand didn't let go. Then another hand. Then another. Visible forces dragging him toward one of the cold storage drawers. He kicked, he fought, he begged, and the last thing Ethan saw before being pulled inside was the drawer slamming shut in his face. The darkness inside the morgue was absolute, heavier than anything Ethan had ever felt. He pressed against the walls of the cold drawer, thrashing desperately, but the metal didn't budge. His screams echoed in the confined space, muffled as though the hospital itself swallowed his voice. His lungs burned, each breath shallow and ragged. The air was damp, carrying a faint chemical stench, and it was getting harder to breathe. He pounded on the door, his fists splitting against the steel, warm blood smearing the surface, but nothing changed. Then, through the silence, he heard it. A slow, rhythmic tapping from the drawer above him. Tap, 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 each sound deliberate, too measured to be random. He froze, listening, his heart hammering so hard it hurt. Then the tapping spread. See, a knock from the drawer beneath him, another from the side. Soon the entire wall was alive, with sound hands pounding, claws scratching, fists slamming from inside the other drawers. Ethan's stomach twisted. He wasn't alone. Every drawer was filled, every space around him occupied. And whatever was inside was trying to get out. The whispers returned, louder than ever, flooding his mind. They weren't just voices anymore. They were memories, screams of agony, pleading cries, prayers unanswered. He clamped his hands over his ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't outside. It was inside his skull, tearing at his sanity. Suddenly, the drawer shuddered, and the walls around him began to dent inward. Hands pressed through the steel, pale and rotting, fingers snapping as they clawed toward him. He kicked frantically, his heels striking against one of the arms, but more kept pushing through, breaking the impossible barrier. The space grew colder. Frost spread across the metal walls, searing his skin as he pressed against them. His breath came out in shallow white clouds. And then a new sound joined the chorus, a low rasp, dragging words through shattered teeth. "Stay with us. Stay forever." He thrashed harder, his body aching, blood dripping from fresh cuts. The drawer suddenly lurched forward, sliding open with a screeching, metallic groan. Ethan fell out, landing hard on the morgue floor, gasping for air. But the relief didn't last. The cold storage doors around the room were opening one by one, creaking wide, shadows spilling out from each. Figures emerged slowly, crawling, staggering, dragging themselves closer. Their eyes were empty sockets, their mouths gaping open, each of them releasing a soundless scream. Ethan scrambled to his feet, grabbing his flashlight again. He shined the beam wildly, but the light only made things worse. Every face it touched twisted and decayed, peeling away like old paint. Their hands reached out, dozens of them, trying to pull him back into the drawers. The room spun as he backed away, his shoulder hitting another steel door. It swung open at the touch, and for a brief moment, he saw what looked like himself lying inside. His own body, pale and lifeless, staring back with eyes that should have been closed but weren't. His legs nearly gave out. He staggered back, dropping the flashlight, the beam rolling across the floor to illuminate the horde advancing on him. Their movements weren't natural. They jerked and twitched as though controlled by invisible strings. One figure broke away from the group, taller than the rest, its head bent at an impossible angle. It leaned close, its voice rattling through a hollow throat. "You were already dead when you walked in," Ethan screamed, shoving past the crowd, his skin tearing as cold hands scraped against him. He ran toward the far wall, where a single red exit sign glowed faintly above a door. His heart leaped at the sight, finally, a way out. But When he reached it, the door didn't lead outside. Hey, it opened back into the morgue, the same room, the same corpses, the same shadows waiting for him. Hi, the hospital was folding in on itself, trapping him in endless circles. The whispers now became laughter, mocking, hysterical, shaking the walls until the lights burst overhead. Ethan fell to his knees, clutching his head, tears streaming down his face. He knew now there was no escape. The hospital had claimed him, just like it had claimed everyone before him. And as the shadows swarmed, closing in from all sides, his final scream was swallowed whole, fading into the walls where countless others had been silenced before. Ethan wasn't one to back down from a challenge. His friends often joked he'd do anything for a thrill. Hey, and when they teased him about the abandoned Riverside Hospital, he laughed it off. Rumors of patients vanishing, lights flickering at night, and unholy screams from the morgue didn't scare him. In fact, they excited him. So one late evening, Ethan set out with only a flashlight, his phone, and a smug grin. The moment he stepped inside, the air shifted, cold, heavy, almost wet. Something about the silence told him he had just walked into a place that wanted him there. Ethan stood still in the lobby, his flashlight sweeping over broken glass and scattered papers that had been left untouched for decades. The walls were covered in mold, the paint bubbled and peeling away in long strips. He had expected silence, but the quiet here was heavier than he imagined, like the walls themselves were listening. He tried to shake off the unease with a laugh, recording a quick clip on his phone, speaking into the camera as though he were making a vlog. His voice bounced back at him, unnaturally distorted, deeper, almost like someone else was speaking along with him. He frowned at the playback, but brushed it off, convincing himself it was just the building's acoustics. Moving down the first hallway, his boots crunched against shards of tile that had fallen from the ceiling. Old signs still hung crooked above the doors. Pediatrics, surgery, morgue. The last one made him grin nervously. I'll save that for later, he muttered under his breath, trying to sound braver than he felt. The deeper he went, the colder the air grew. His flashlight beam caught the shine of something on the wall. He stepped closer and froze. Handprints, smeared in what looked like old, dried blood, trailed down the corridor. They were small, childlike, pressed against the paint as if someone had been dragged along. His skin prickled with goosebumps. He told himself it was a prank, some urban explorers messing with people. Still, he found himself whispering, "Hello?" His voice cracked. The sound echoed unnaturally, as if it traveled much farther than the walls should have allowed. Then came a sound he couldn't explain. A faint hum, like the buzzing of fluorescent lights, but there was no power in the building. It grew louder the more he listened, a steady rhythm that almost sounded like breathing. He turned a corner and nearly dropped his flashlight. In the middle of the hallway stood a wheelchair. It was facing the wrong way, its back toward him, but it slowly began to roll forward on its own. The rubber wheels squeaked against the floor, moving just far enough to scrape against the wall before stopping. Ethan swallowed hard. He tried to laugh it off, pulling out his phone to record, but when he checked the screen, the camera wouldn't focus. It only showed static, flickering shapes darting across the lens like shadows running just out of sight. He lowered the phone quickly, his pulse hammering in his ears. He pressed forward, determined not to let fear win. As he passed the wheelchair, the temperature dropped so sharply his breath came out in a white cloud. The air smelled faintly metallic, sharp, like rust or blood. He gagged and pulled his sleeve over his nose. At the end of the hallway, he found an open door leading to what must have once been a patient's room. Beds were overturned, sheets shredded, and on the wall above the bed, words had been scratched deep into the plaster. "Don't let them take you." The edges of the letters were stained dark, and, for a moment, Ethan thought he saw them glisten, wet and fresh, though the message had to be decades old. The door slammed shut behind him with a force that rattled the walls. He spun, his flashlight beam darting wildly, but there was no one there. His hand shook as he grabbed the handle, twisting with all his strength, but it was locked tight. Whispers began to fill the room, at first faint, almost like a draft moving through cracks, but soon distinct words. He pressed his ear to the door, heart racing, and heard voices overlapping, crying, pleading, angry, all layered together. One phrase rose above them all. "Stay." His breath caught in his throat. He stumbled back from the door, the flashlight slipping in his sweaty grip. The beam landed on the bed again, and this time there was something lying on it. A lump beneath the shredded sheets, the outline of a body. Ethan's mouth went dry. He inched forward, unable to stop himself. His light trembled as he pulled the sheets back just enough to see a pale hand, stiff and cold, fingers curled as if reaching for help. Before he could scream, the hand twitched. The fingers jerked, then clawed at the sheets, pulling them tighter around the shape beneath. Ethan staggered backward, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He turned, slamming his shoulder into the door again, and to his surprise, it swung open this time, nearly throwing him into the hallway. He didn't look back. He ran, his boots pounding the floor, the whispers chasing after him like footsteps just at his heels. No matter how fast he moved, the voices stayed close, murmuring his name now, whispering it like they had known him all along. The corridors stretched on endlessly, covered in peeling paint and rust. His flashlight illuminated old hospital beds, tipped on their sides, and scattered medical charts littering the floor. Then he saw words scrawled on the wall in what looked like dried blood. Dan T. Stay after midnight. He smirked, thinking it was a prank left behind by other explorers. But when he checked his watch, his heart skipped. The second hand was frozen. The time read 11:59 p.m. It didn't matter how many times he tapped the face, the clock refused to move. And the words on the wall no longer looked like graffiti, looked like a warning. Ethan's stomach turned as he stared at the frozen hands of his watch. It didn't make sense. The air around him seemed colder now, pressing against his skin like invisible fingers. He shook his wrist harder, smacking the face of the watch, but the time refused to change. It was as though the hospital had swallowed time whole, trapping him in its own clock. He told himself it was just a coincidence. Maybe his watch had died at the worst possible moment. Still, the thought gnawed at him. Why would it stop at that exact minute? The same one scratched on the wall. His throat tightened as he forced himself to look away. The beam of his flashlight swung forward, cutting across the darkness. The light caught a broken gurney lying on its side. The wheels rusted into place. A child's stuffed bear sat abandoned on top of it. One button missing, its fabric shredded. Kay reached out without thinking, brushing dust off its head. Kay, the toy was warm, as if someone had been holding it just moments ago. He dropped it instantly, the bear landing with a soft thud on the cracked tiles. That was when he heard a faint shuffle, somewhere in the distance. It wasn't the echo of his own steps. It was deliberate, slow, dragging. His pulse quickened, and he raised the light toward the sound. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead, lined with half-open doors that creaked as if stirred by a passing breeze. But there was no wind here, no airflow at all. The sound came again, closer this time, a dragging of feet, followed by a long exhale that wasn't his. He whispered, "Who's there?" His voice cracked, bouncing off the walls before dissolving into the silence. The doors on either side of the corridor groaned open by inches. The hinges shrieked softly, one after another, as if unseen hands were pushing them. Ethan's flashlight shook, the beam darting from side to side, but every room he passed looked empty, just broken furniture and peeling paint. Still, the sense of being watched dug deep into him. He picked up the pace, forcing his boots down harder to drown out the sound of the dragging steps. But the faster he moved, the louder the other footsteps became, chasing after him with no clear source. Finally, his light landed on something at the end of the hall. A figure stood in the shadows, too far away to see clearly, but tall and still, its head bent slightly as if listening. Ethan froze, his body refusing to take another step. The figure didn't move. It only stood there, waiting. His breath caught in his chest. He blinked, and the figure was gone. Empty space. Relief washed through him for only a second before he noticed something chilling. The bear he had dropped earlier was now lying in the middle of the hall in front of him, its single eye staring up at him. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. He didn't hear the figure move, didn't see it, but it had been close enough to pick up the toy and leave it in his path. That meant he wasn't alone. The whisper came again, soft and broken, brushing his ear as if spoken directly beside him. "Stay." Ethan whipped around, but no one was there. Dark corridor, stretching behind him, impossibly long, impossibly quiet. His chest heaved, sweat dripping down his back as the oppressive weight of the building bore down on him. He told himself to keep moving, that standing still was worse, but the words on the wall replayed in his mind with every step. "Don't stay after midnight." He tried not to look at his watch again, but curiosity got the better of him. Raising his wrist with trembling fingers, he saw the same frozen time staring back at him. 11:59. Not 1 second had passed. He lowered his arms slowly, his legs threatening to give way. If time wasn't moving, then how long had he already been inside? As he ventured deeper, Ethan reached the psychiatric ward. The smell was unbearable: mildew, mold, and something rotten. Inside the cells, scratch marks covered the walls, desperate words carved into the paint. "They won't let us leave. He is still here." His flashlight flickered across the cell door, and for a brief moment he saw a pale face staring back at him. It blinked, then it was gone. His stomach turned, and when the dragging sound started a slow, deliberate scrape moving toward him, Ethan realized the hospital wasn't empty at all. Ethan's heart slammed against his chest as the sound grew louder, scraping closer with each breath he took. His flashlight trembled in his hand, its weak beam catching glimpses of rusted bars and peeling paint, but nothing solid, nothing that explained the noise. The psychiatric ward felt heavier than the rest of the hospital, as if the walls themselves had soaked up every scream, every ounce of despair that had once lived here. He took a step back, but the floor beneath him groaned. The sound echoed down the corridor, and suddenly the scraping stopped. Silence pressed down, thick and suffocating. He waited, his lungs burning as he held his breath, praying that whatever it was had lost interest. Then, from the darkness ahead, came the sound of metal dragging against stone. It was sharper now, deliberate, like someone pulling a chain across the floor. Ethan's throat went dry, and he forced himself to whisper, "Who's there?" But the silence that followed was worse than any answer. He inched closer to one of the cells, his light sweeping over the walls. Words carved into the plaster stood out deep and jagged. "Don't look at him." The message was repeated over and over, scrawled until the letters blurred together. His stomach twisted as he imagined the desperation it must have taken to etch those words with bare fingernails. A sound behind him made him spin, the flashlight jerking wildly. For a fraction of a second, he thought he saw someone leaning against the bars of a cell, thin arms gripping metal, a pale face staring straight at him with hollow eyes. But when the light steadied, the cell was empty. His breathing came fast, ragged. He backed away, bumping into another door. The hinges groaned, swinging it open just enough to reveal a padded cell inside. The padding was torn to shreds, yellow foam spilling out like entrails. In the center of the room, carved into the floor with something sharp, was a crude figure of a man with no face. Ethan stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet. The dragging sound started again, this time from the opposite end of the hall. It was closer, quicker, like whoever or whatever was moving had picked up speed. His fight-or-flight instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The beam of his flashlight flickered, dimming, as if drained by something in the air. He smacked it against his palm, desperate to keep it alive. That was when he saw it, the far end of the corridor, just beyond the reach of his light. A tall shadow stretched across the floor. It was thin, impossibly thin, yet its arms seemed to drag along the ground, scraping metal against tile. Ethan's chest seized as the shadow stretched longer, creeping closer, even though nothing visible moved. He blinked, and suddenly it wasn't at the end of the hall anymore. It was 3 doors away. The panic finally broke through his paralysis. He turned and sprinted down the hallway, the beam bouncing erratically. Doors slammed shut around him, one after another, as if the hospital itself was sealing him in. The sound of chains rattled close behind, and he could feel cold air brushing the back of his neck. He shoved through another doorway and slammed it shut, pressing his weight against it, as if that would help. The dragging sound stopped outside the door, replaced by a low, guttural breathing. It lingered for long, unbearable moments before fading into silence. His knees gave out, and he slid to the floor, his chest heaving. The stench of rot filled his nose, stronger here than anywhere else. When he raised his flashlight, he realized he had stumbled into the morgue. Stainless steel drawers lined the walls, each one large enough to hold a body. The air was so cold, his breath clouded in front of him. He whispered to himself, "It's empty. It's empty. It's all empty." But even as he said it, one of the drawers screeched open an inch on its own. Then another, then another. Ethan scrambled backward, his spine pressing against the wall as drawer after drawer slid open. The metallic clang echoing through the room. His flashlight caught glimpses of pale, withered hands slipping out from the darkness inside, curling as if reaching for him. He screamed and bolted for the door, fumbling with the handle until it gave way. He stumbled back into the hallway, gasping for breath, the cold air of the morgue still clinging to his skin. The dragging sound began again, this time from both directions. Ethan froze, his head snapping left, then right. Shadows stretched toward him from each end of the corridor, moving with unnatural speed. Desperation gripped him as he pushed open the nearest door and slipped inside, slamming it shut behind him. He pressed his ear against the wood, listening as the scraping surrounded the room, circling like predators closing in. Inside the room, his flashlight illuminated rows of rusted beds. Restraints dangled from them like skeletal hands. And carved into the headboard of the nearest bed were 3 words that made his blood run cold. "You are next." He backed away slowly, his entire body trembling. The whispers started again, low and unrelenting, weaving through the air. They were clearer at this time, and among the countless voices, one rose above the rest, deep, commanding, and filled with hunger. It spoke his name. Every hallway twisted back onto itself. No matter which door he opened, he ended up in the same place. His phone buzzed in his pocket, the screen flickering to life with a new video. When he played it, he saw himself standing in the surgical ward, but there was someone behind him. A tall, faceless figure tilting its head, reaching for his shoulder. The video cut out just before contact. Ethan dropped the phone, his breathing uneven, his flashlight beam shaking across the walls. That's when the whispers started. Dozens of voices, crying, laughing, pleading surrounding him from every direction. Ethan clutched at his chest, feeling his heartbeat slam against his ribs as the whispers grew louder, overlapping until they drowned out his thoughts. His flashlight flickered wildly, beams of light stuttering across the ceiling like lightning. Every time the light dimmed, he swore he could see movement in the corners of the room, shadows crawling along the walls. Reaching for him with stretched, claw-like fingers. He bent down to grab his phone, but the screen was already cracked, spiderweb fractures spreading across the glass. It buzzed again in his hand, showing the same video on loop. Himself, standing in that surgical ward, the faceless figure looming closer each time. But this time, the figure wasn't just behind him. It was looking directly into the phone's camera, as though aware he was watching. The video cut off, leaving the screen black. Then, faintly, his reflection appeared on the screen. But it wasn't alone. Over his shoulder, in the reflection, stood the figure, closer than before. Ethan hurled the phone across the room, his voice cracking in terror as it shattered against the wall. The whispers stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse, suffocating, pressing against his eardrums. He turned in a slow circle, flashlight trembling, expecting something to leap out at him. Instead, a long, low creak echoed down the hall, like a door slowly opening. Summoning what little courage he had left, Ethan stepped into the corridor. The tiles beneath his boots felt softer now, as though the ground itself had begun to rot. He glanced down and realized with horror that faint footprints, wet, glistening, and barefoot, were appearing in front of him, leading deeper into the ward. Against every instinct, he followed. The footprints guided him to a pair of double doors, marked surgery, their windows fogged with condensation from the inside. His hand shook as he pushed them open. The smell hit him immediately, thick, metallic, and foul, like rust mixed with rotting flesh. Inside, surgical tables were still set up, covered with torn sheets, stained brown and red. Rusted tools lay scattered across trays, scalpels, saws, clamps. Some were so sharp they still gleamed faintly in his flashlight beam. But it wasn't he. The tools that froze him in place. It was the sound of steady breathing coming from the far side of the room. He held the light steady, pointing it toward the sound. At first, nothing. Then he saw a figure hunched over one of the tables, its back to him. The shoulders rose and fell slowly, each breath rattling, wet and unnatural. The figure's arms twitched, moving as though working on something unseen. Teen's throat closed. He took one step back, praying the floor wouldn't betray him. But the tile let out a sharp crack under his boot. The figure froze. The breathing stopped. Slowly, impossibly slow, the figure's head turned toward him. It didn't have a face, just smooth, pale skin stretched tight. No eyes, no mouth. Yet somehow, Ethan knew it was staring directly into him. His flashlight flickered again, plunging the room into near darkness. When the beam came back, the figure was gone. The table it had been standing over was now empty. Ethan spun in a panic, swinging the light in every direction. That was when he felt the unmistakable sensation of cold fingers brushing the back of his neck. He screamed and bolted toward the door, slamming through it so hard the frame splintered. He didn't stop running. His breath came in ragged gasps, sweat and fear burning in his eyes. But every hallway looked the same, twisting and turning, folding back onto itself. The doors he opened only led him in circles, each room filled with the same shadows, the same oppressive weight. Desperate, he tried another door and stumbled into what looked like a children's ward. Tiny beds lined the walls, some overturned, others still made up with moldy blankets. Toys littered the floor dolls, missing their heads, cars with broken wheels. In the center of the room stood a rocking horse, swaying gently back and forth, though no one touched it. He froze, watching the horse rock faster, the creak of its wooden joints echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. Then came the giggle, high-pitched, childlike, but twisted, echoing from every corner of the room. Ethan clutched his flashlight, backing toward the door. The giggle turned into dozens of laughs, overlapping until they became shrieks. Tiny shadows darted across the floor, circling him, too fast to follow. Something tugged at his ankle, then his sleeve, then his hair, pulling from every direction. He stumbled, falling against one of the beds, his flashlight slipping from his grip. The beam rolled across the floor and landed on the wall. Scrawled in crude, jagged letters, was a single message. "He's here." Ethan lunged for the flashlight, gripping it tight. His pulse roared in his ears, and for a moment, all the voices fell silent again. He turned slowly, raising the light toward the far corner of the room. The faceless figure stood there, taller than before, its head bent, arms hanging long enough to scrape the floor. It didn't move, but Ethan's light flickered uncontrollably, as though fighting to stay on. Then, without warning, the doors behind him slammed shut, locking him inside with it. The stench hit him before he reached the door. The morgue was colder than the rest of the building, frost clinging to the steel drawers. As he stepped inside, one drawer creaked open. Against every instinct, Ethan peered inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. Was his own body, pale and lifeless, eyes open and staring. He staggered back, his flashlight clattering to the floor. The other drawers began to open one by one, and shapes began to crawl out. Their mouths stretched wide in silent screams, their hands reaching for him. He screamed and ran, but no matter how far he moved, he was always back in the morgue. The stench clung to him as he stumbled backward, gagging on the rot that filled his lungs. The sight of his own lifeless body, staring with glassy eyes from that drawer, refused to leave his mind. He wanted to run, to tear himself away, but his legs felt like they were sinking into the cold tiles beneath him. The steel drawers screeched louder, opening in unison like a choir of metal jaws. Shapes dragged themselves out bodies, thin and brittle, their bones cracking with every movement. Their mouths stretched open far too wide, but no sound came. Silent screams filled the air, their faces twisted in agony. Ethan's flashlight spun across the room, catching pale arms reaching toward him, fingers bending at impossible angles. His pulse hammered in his skull, and when he finally forced his legs to move, he turned and bolted for the door. But no matter how far he ran, the hall bent back into itself, the morgue swallowing him again and again. He slammed into the same drawer room, panting, wild-eyed, as though the hospital was folding him into a loop. He grabbed at the walls, clawing at peeling paint, as if he could tear his way out, but the cold metal of the drawers was always behind him. The whispers began again, now clearer, as if the dead were finally finding their voices. They spoke his name in a chorus of tonesmen, women, children, all calling for him, pleading for him. He clamped his hands over his ears, shouting for them to stop, but their cries drilled into his skull. He stumbled into the middle of the morgue, surrounded by the crawling bodies, their arms brushing his legs, their touch freezing his skin. One of them caught his wrist. Its grip was stronger than bone should allow, pulling him toward its gaping mouth. He yanked free, skin tearing beneath the force, his own blood dripping to the floor in dark drops that vanished as they hit the tiles. Ethan spun wildly, kicking one of the corpses back, the brittle body collapsing into dust. But for each that fell, two more dragged themselves free. The morgue was filling with them, their eyeless faces twitching as they closed in. His flashlight flickered, then died completely, plunging him into blackness. He was blind now, relying only on his ragged breaths and the scraping of bone against stone to know they were still there. Panic drove him forward. His hands found the drawer handles, cold and slick with condensation. He pulled himself past them, trying to find the door by memory, but every time he touched one, the whispering grew louder. A sudden burst of light seared his vision, his flashlight sputtering back to life for a heartbeat. In that flash, he saw them. Dozens of figures circling him, their mouths open, eyes hollow, all pointing at him. The light died again, leaving him in suffocating dark. He dropped to his knees, his chest convulsing, unable to catch his breath. It felt as though the air itself had thickened, pressing into his lungs. Something wet dripped onto his shoulder. He froze, dread anchoring him in place. Slowly, his trembling hand reached up to touch it. Warm, sticky, blood. He lifted his gaze upward, though the dark showed him nothing. But he felt it's something looming above him, impossibly tall, its presence crushing. The air vibrated with its breath, slow and deliberate, rattling the metal around him. The whispers stopped all at once, replaced by a single voice, deep, hollow, and final. "You are already here." Ethan staggered backward, shaking his head, his body refusing to accept the words. His back hit one of the cold drawers, and to his horror, it slid open on its own. He turned, ready to run again, and there he was, his own corpse, staring back with the same wide eyes, lips curling into a grotesque grin that hadn't been there before. "Kay," he screamed, his voice breaking as the other bodies closed in, dragging themselves closer, their hands clawing the floor, their mouths opening wider and wider until all was swallowed by silence. Ethan's final moments were chaos. Cold hands pulled at his clothes, dragging him toward an open drawer. His flashlight flickered, sparks dancing against the walls, revealing dozens of faces pressing through the steel faces of the dead who had come before him. They whispered his name over and over until he could barely think. He fought, clawed, begged, but the shadows swallowed him whole. When morning came, his car was still parked outside. The doors of the hospital remained locked tight, no sign of anyone inside. Weeks later, police found his phone in the grass. The only file was a single video Ethan whispering over and over, "Don't stay after midnight. Don't stay after midnight," ChatGPT said. Ethan clawed at the floor, his nails tearing against the tiles as cold hands locked around his ankles and wrists. He screamed until his throat burned, his voice echoing back at him like it was being swallowed by the walls themselves. The morgue drawers screeched open wider, metal bending as though alive, and the corpses inside writhed in the shadows, waiting to claim him. His flashlight burst back to life for a split second, its beams slicing across the room. The light revealed what he didn't want to see: the tall, faceless figure standing directly above him. Its head tilted slowly, impossibly far, like a predator curious about its prey. Ethan froze, paralyzed, his body trembling as the figure raised one long arm and pointed toward the open drawer behind him. The light flickered out again, plunging everything into choking darkness. He felt the cold pull on his body grow stronger, dragging him inch by inch closer to the gaping steel mouth. His fingernails ripped away as he tried to dig into the floor, blood streaking the tiles, but the force wouldn't let him go. In the dark, his mind played tricks on him. Maybe it didn't. He swore he could hear his mother's voice calling him, gentle, soothing, telling him to stop fighting. Then it shifted into his own voice, whispering the same words he'd seen carved into the walls. "Don, stay after midnight." His body hit the edge of the drawer, metal biting into his back. He kicked and twisted, but the corpses inside reached for him, their mouths opening in silent shrieks, their fingers scraping his skin with each desperate tug. Ethan's head thrashed wildly, his breath sobbing out of him. "Please, no please, no please." His voice cracked as he tried to summon any shred of hope, but hope had no place here. The morgue was a hungry thing, and he was already claimed. The faceless figure leaned closer, its breath ice against his ear, though it had no mouth. A deep vibration rattled his bones, and the words carved into his mind like a brand: "You were never meant to leave." The drawer slammed shut. For a moment, there was only silence, the morgue calm once more. But inside, Ethan screamed, his fists pounding against the steel from within. "Hey," his voice muffled, growing weaker with every strike. The other drawers answered. They banged in unison, shaking violently, as though dozens of trapped souls were trying to claw their way out at the same time. The entire hospital groaned with the sound, dust raining from the ceiling. And then, suddenly, everything stilled. The morgue went silent, the drawers closed, the air unmoving. Only Ethan's flashlight remained on the floor, its beam steady now, pointing at nothing. Hours passed, though no clock ticked inside. Outside, his car sat in the empty lot, dew gathering on its windshield. No one came, No one left. The hospitals swallowed its secret whole. Days turned into weeks before anyone thought to look for him. By then, the building was locked tight, its rusted chains unmoved, as if no one had disturbed them for years. The authorities forced their way inside, combing through the dust and shadows, but they found no trace of Ethan. The only thing left behind was his phone, lying half buried in the grass just outside the main doors. Its screen was cracked, the battery nearly dead. When they powered it on, there was only a single video file stored. In the grainy footage, Ethan sat in a dark hallway, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. He rocked back and forth, whispering to the camera, his voice hoarse, broken. "Don't stay after midnight," he murmured. His gaze darted over his shoulder, then back to the lens. "Don't stay after midnight. Don't." The footage looped, the whisper repeating endlessly. And though the timestamp showed the video had been recorded days after Ethan vanished, no one could explain how. Rumors spread quickly. Some said the hospital claimed anyone foolish enough to enter after midnight, keeping them in its endless halls forever. Others swore Ethan was still inside, wandering the corridors, whispering warnings to anyone who dared follow. Late at night, passersby sometimes reported seeing faint lights flicker behind the broken windows, or hearing a man's muffled voice calling from deep within. But when they checked, the building remained locked, and the phone, it still worked, even after weeks of exposure. The video remained uncorrupted, Ethan's whisper trapped in its memory, echoing again and again. "Don't stay after midnight."